4 notes. 3 short, 1 long. DDDUM. Ludwig van Beethoven described this motif, the opening of his Fifth Symphony, as fate knocking at the door. He wrote it while going deaf. He finished it deaf. He conducted its premiere deaf, standing next to the actual conductor so the orchestra could follow a real baton, turning pages of a score he could no longer hear. When it was over, he was still facing the orchestra. A singer in the chorus turned him around so he could see the audience on its feet. This is Beethoven's story. A man for whom the one sense a musician cannot lose was taken from him, and who responded by writing the Ninth Symphony. Who responded, in other words, by writing the piece that would become the anthem of the European Union, the piece played at the fall of the Berlin Wall, the piece that the Voyager spacecraft carried into interstellar space as a sample of what humanity had produced. He did this deaf. He did it in the last decade of his life, when he was communicating with friends by passing them notebooks to write in. He did it because he had decided, in a moment of crisis that he described in a letter he never sent, that his music was more important than his suffering. Bonn, the child who was not Mozart. Ludwig van Beethoven was born in Bonn in December 1770. Baptized on the 17th, which is the only date we know for certain, since his father registered him as a year younger than he actually was, either by accident or in an attempt to make his son seem more impressive as a child prodigy. Johann van Beethoven had seen what Mozart's father had achieved by marketing his son's gifts across Europe, and he wanted something similar. The methods he used were considerably less affectionate than Leopold Mozart's. Johann's lessons were conducted at any hour of the day or night, with punishment for mistakes. Ludwig's childhood was marked by musical drilling of considerable severity and domestic instability of equal measure. His mother died young, his father descended into alcoholism, and by his early teens Ludwig was effectively supporting the family. The music he was being forced to practice became simultaneously his burden and his refuge, which may be one reason he never entirely separated the two. The relationship that actually formed him was with Christian Gottlob Neefe, the court organist who took Ludwig on as a student and understood what he was looking at. Neefe taught him counterpoint and composition, introduced him to Bach's Well-Tempered Clavier, then still a relatively obscure work, and to the literature and philosophy of the German Enlightenment, Goethe, Schiller, Kant. He also arranged for Ludwig to serve as his deputy at the court organ when he was 12 years old, and wrote in a music journal that if Ludwig continued on his current trajectory, he would become one of the greatest musicians of his age. He was not wrong. Vienna, conquering the musical capital. Beethoven arrived in Vienna in 1792, at 21, with a letter of introduction to Joseph Haydn, who had heard him play in Bonn and recognized the talent immediately. Mozart had died the previous year. The position of greatest living composer was, in some sense, vacant. Beethoven did not apply for it modestly. He studied with Haydn, with the contrapuntist Johann Georg Albrechtsberger, and with Antonio Salieri, who taught him the specific demands of vocal and theatrical writing. The lessons with Haydn were productive but tense. Beethoven found Haydn's corrections insufficiently rigorous, Haydn found Beethoven's personality difficult, and they both were probably right. What Beethoven took from Haydn was an understanding of large-scale formal structure and a sense of how humor and surprise could function within that structure. What he added to it was something Haydn had not attempted: weight. Vienna came to know him first as a pianist, and what it heard was unlike anything the city's musical culture had produced. His playing was physically powerful, he regularly broke strings and cracked soundboards, and harmonically adventurous. He improvised in ways that left audiences silent before they remembered to applaud. In the competitive world of Viennese musical life, where pianists regularly challenged each other to public contests of improvisation, Beethoven won consistently, and the people he defeated remembered it for the rest of their lives. The early piano sonatas, including the Pathetic, which he published in 1799, established that he was not simply a remarkable performer but a composer of the first rank, extending the formal vocabulary of the sonata into emotional territory that Haydn and Mozart had not mapped. The Heiligenstadt Testament, the decision to live. The hearing loss began around 1796, tinnitus first, then progressive reduction of the frequency range he could perceive, then silence. By 1802 he knew it was permanent and irreversible. He was 31 years old, at the beginning of what should have been the most productive decades of his career, and the one sense his profession required was leaving him. In the autumn of 1802, staying in the quiet village of Heiligenstadt outside Vienna, he wrote a letter to his brothers that he never sent and that was found in his desk after his death. It is one of the most extraordinary documents in the history of art, a suicide note that talks itself out of suicide. He describes the humiliation of not being able to hear a shepherd's flute in the fields, of asking people to repeat things he could not make out and watching their confusion when a musician of his reputation could not hear a simple sound. He describes considering death as a solution. And then he describes deciding against it, because he had not yet produced what he felt he had been put on earth to produce. It seemed impossible to leave the world until I had produced all that I felt called upon to produce, he wrote. He went back to Vienna. The following year he completed the Third Symphony. The heroic period, music as defiance. The decade between 1803 and roughly 1814 produced the works that most people think of when they think of Beethoven, the Third, Fourth, Fifth, Sixth, and Seventh Symphonies, the Fourth and Fifth Piano Concertos, the Violin Concerto, the Opera Fidelio, the Razumovsky Quartets, and a series of piano sonatas that includes the Waldstein, the Appassionata, and Les Adieus. The scale of production in this period, and the scale of individual works, has no real parallel in the history of Western music. The Third Symphony, the Eroica, was originally dedicated to Napoleon Bonaparte, whom Beethoven admired as an embodiment of the revolutionary ideals of liberty and equality that he had absorbed from the Enlightenment writers Neefe had introduced him to in Bonn. When Napoleon declared himself emperor in 1804, Beethoven reportedly flew into a rage, crossed out the dedication so violently that he tore through the paper, and renamed the symphony simply Heroic Symphony, composed to celebrate the memory of a great man. The great man, it turned out, was not Napoleon but the idea of heroism itself, a concept Beethoven spent the rest of his career investigating. The Fifth Symphony, for notes, C minor to C major, darkness to light, is the most purely architectural thing Beethoven ever wrote. The opening motif does not recur as a theme, it generates everything. Every melody, every transition, every harmonic turn in the symphony's four movements grows from those four notes in ways that feel simultaneously inevitable and surprising. The finale resolves the long struggle into a C major of almost aggressive brightness. Beethoven added trombones, a contraffigato, and a piccolo to the orchestra for this finale, instruments that had never before appeared in a symphony, and the effect was of a door opening onto a space larger than the room that preceded it. The Ninth, a symphony for deaf ears. The Ninth Symphony, completed in 1824, is the work by which Beethoven is most commonly measured and most commonly misunderstood. Its reputation for transcendence, for being the piece that proves what music can be, has surrounded it with a layer of reverence that makes it difficult to hear what it actually does. What it actually does is spend three movements in a state of sustained formal and emotional tension, circling around problems it refuses to resolve, before introducing, in the finale, a bass voice singing over a recollection of the symphony's previous themes, not these sounds. The voices that follow, soloists and full chorus, set Schiller's poem Ode to Joy, which Beethoven had been wanting to set to music for nearly 30 years. The text calls for universal brotherhood, for the embrace of all human beings by all others, for joy as a divine force that transcends suffering. The music does not illustrate this text, it argues for it, building from a single melodic line to a complexity of voices and instruments that, in the final pages, produces something close to controlled chaos before the brass bring it to its conclusion. At the premiere, Beethoven stood near the conductor and turned pages he could not hear. When the audience applauded, they applauded through all four movements, which was unusual, he could not hear that either. The contralto Caroline Unger stepped forward and turned him to face the hall. He saw people on their feet, hats in the air, programs waving. He bowed. It was the last major work he ever conducted. The Last Years and the Immortal Beloved. After his death on March 26, 1827, during a thunderstorm, which Beethoven's friends later found appropriate. A search of his belongings turned up two things that had been unknown to almost everyone who knew him. The first was a small portrait of a woman, unidentified. The second was a letter, dated July 6 to 7 of a year that is not specified, addressed to "My Immortal Beloved, Mijn Unsterbliche Geliefde," and never sent. The letter is a love letter of considerable intensity, written to a woman Beethoven clearly expected to see that day or the next, describing the agony of separation, the depth of his feeling, and the impossibility of his situation. He refers to her as his wife, a description that could be metaphorical or could reflect an actual private commitment of some kind. He never names her. The letter was found in a secret drawer, which means it had been kept deliberately hidden, and deliberately not destroyed over the decades since it was written. Who the Immortal Beloved was is a question that musicologists have been arguing about since 1827. The leading candidates are Antony Brentano, a Frankfurt noblewoman who knew Beethoven well in Vienna in the period when the letter was most likely written. Josephine Brunswick, a widow with whom he had a documented intense correspondence in the early 1800s, and Giulietta Guicciardi, to whom the Moonlight Sonata was dedicated. The most recent scholarly consensus tends toward Antony Brentano, but the evidence is circumstantial and the argument continues. Beethoven, who was capable of extreme verbal directness in almost every other area of his life, left this question permanently open. The last decade of his life was marked by complete deafness, by legal battles over the guardianship of his nephew Karl, a prolonged and painful conflict that consumed enormous energy and ended ambiguously, and by the composition of the late quartets, which are among the most discussed and most technically demanding works in the chamber music repertoire. String players who worked through the late quartets described the experience as confronting music that seems to be addressed to a different kind of listener than the one sitting in the concert hall, music that is complete in itself, indifferent to performance, existing at a level of abstraction that the physical act of playing barely touches. More than 20,000 people attended his funeral procession through Vienna, roughly a tenth of the city's population. Franz Schubert, who had been too intimidated to introduce himself to Beethoven during his lifetime, was one of the pallbearers. He died 8 months later.